We have got two phenomenal keynote speakers today, and we're going to start off with our first keynote speaker, Fozia Irfan OBE. And it's my privilege to introduce her to you, and I'm going to have to refer to my notes because I think if I gave her a full introduction, it would take out the 45 minutes that we've got aligned for Fozia. But let me just give you a little bit of a highlight. So Fozia is a truly distinguished individual in the field of philanthropy. Easy for me to say, and social justice as well. So she's the Director of Impact and Influence for BBC Children in Need, and that sort of specialises in the equitable funding distribution of investment for young people across the country. She was awarded the National Rising Star CEO Award for the National Charity Times and voted one of the most 25 influential charity leaders within the sector. Amongst many other appointments, she is the chair of 360 Giving and sits on the board of the Alliance magazine. She was awarded the OBE for her services to community through the COVID pandemic, and Fozia is a tireless advocate for inclusive practices within philanthropy, setting up the groundbreaking Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Coalition of Foundations. So having recently written a Churchill report entitled Transformative Philanthropy, I can't say that word. I don't know why I keep trying, right? But I'll get there by the end of the day. Maybe you can help me, Fozia. Fozia's got a really kind of unique approach to philanthropy, and I'm delighted to welcome her to the stage. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. It's amazing to be here. But before I start, there are two apologies that I have to give. Firstly, my voice is a bit croaky, so if I have to pause, just excuse me, and I'll drink some water. And secondly, another apology is because I actually turned down this invitation to come and speak to you because I thought they had the wrong person. So when Kirsty and Alistair first approached me, they emailed me, they sent me a lovely email saying, you know, we've got this brilliant organisation, we've got this brilliant conference, and we'd love you to speak. And I sent it to my PA, who literally collapsed laughing, because I'm known as being one of the most technologically inept people. I managed to log myself out of the BBC out of my BBC account yesterday because I logged onto the wrong Wi-Fi network. I mean, that's my level of ineptitude. But I think the reason why Alistair and Kirsty invited me to speak is because we do actually share something. And that something is incredibly important. It's our motivation. So your motivation for being here, my motivation for doing the work that I do, I think is incredibly similar. The reason why you're all here is because you're interested in something which is about more than money, it's about more than your job, it's about more than status, it's about giving back, it's about utilising our individual talents to create social change. And that's something obviously that I share with you. And one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today is philanthropy, and hopefully by the end of the day you'll all be able to say the word properly. But you know, before I entered the world of philanthropy, I didn't even know it existed, and I couldn't say those words either. But what I'm going to try and persuade you is that we should be focusing our efforts on change and not charity. And you might be surprised at that, given that I work for one of the best-loved charities in the UK. But I'm going to take you through why charities and philanthropy, thank you so much, Kirsty, are failing to address the greatest challenges of our time, why we need new models of thinking and new tools, and why your role within this is incredibly important. So before I launch into the meat of the conversation, I want to talk about these two words, charity and philanthropy, because I use them in a very specific context. I'm sure I don't need to explain to you what charities are. You know, they're well known to you. They're part of the social infrastructure of the organisation, and they provide services to those most in need in society. Philanthropy, however, is a much more secretive world, which as a layperson I was completely unaware of until I fell into it. So institutional philanthropy, which is what I'm going to be talking about, is the world of funders, trusts and foundations. Those people who have the money to give grants to charities. The largest 300 foundations alone are estimated to have almost 90 billion in assets, and they give away about 4 billion each year to various charities. And you'll probably have heard of some of the big ones, Lottery, Robertson Trust here in Scotland, Wolfson, etc. Now, why am I talking about philanthropists and funders and foundations? The reason is because they manage the supply of money to the charity sector and can turn the tap on and off. So charities depend on them, and we hold a huge amount of power. But recently, philanthropy, funders, trusts and foundations have faced a lot of criticism, and people are questioning whether philanthropy and the charity model itself is actually working, and are we actually creating the best model for social change. So part of the reason why we as funders and charities are being criticised and scrutinised is due to the circumstances that we live in, which Alistair alluded to. We are living in some of the most challenging times that we have ever faced as a country. And if you talk to anyone within the charity sector, they will mention some of these situations that we're dealing with. The cost of living crisis is something which has really shifted the sector in a way that's never been seen before. Child poverty statistics, we're reaching almost the figures of 4 million children in the UK in 2024 living in poverty. We're in a situation where families are struggling to heat their homes, provide food on their tables. Literally basic necessities that you would take for granted are now people are struggling to find those things. There are lots and lots of campaigns at the moment in relation to social justice. The climate crisis is something which is impacting us all, and not just the developing world. Campaigning for civil rights and equality, we've seen a huge movement in relation to that over the last few years. There has been political turmoil and volatility which has not helped the situation at all. And of course, we can't ignore the impact of the pandemic. Some people are already talking about, oh, well, you know, that was something that happened 2 years ago, 3 years ago. The impact of the pandemic is long-lasting, and we're going to feel it for generations. Now, the culmination of all of these things has meant that charities are being called upon to do more and more, but at the same time, their resources are decreasing. There are some funders and trusts and foundations whose budgets are going down. At the same time, the need is going up. So charities are facing this impossible situation where they're having to do more with less. And again, I'd like you to think about that as we go through the conversation today. And I wanted to just bring these 3 books to your attention to just build on the criticism of philanthropy and trusts and foundations. You may have come across them, but there is a growing movement of scrutiny and criticism of the work that funders and foundations do. And you have to remember that we as funders and foundations shape the sector. So if we decide X is really important, we kind of force charities to do X because that's where the funding is. So our role within this ecosystem is incredibly important. And some of these books, their criticisms I think are really, really valid, and I would urge you to read them if you're interested in social change. The types of things that they talk about are the fact that charity and philanthropy is based on a very Victorian, paternalistic model. I mean, institutional philanthropy really took off in the 1800s, and it was based on, you know, the great and the good being very gracious and giving some of their wealth to the poor and deciding who were the deserving poor, who were the undeserving poor. You know, that language and that model is still part of philanthropy today. We also have criticisms of the fact that a lot of particularly family foundations are dictated to by their owners' own interests. So, for example, Elon Musk, if he decided that he wanted to fund hats for donkeys, he's fully entitled to do that with his money, and there's no requirement on him at all to think about what the world actually needs. We as funders are also criticised for being very siloed and ad hoc in our funding. There is no joined up approach. Very rarely do funders and trusts and foundations work together to address the biggest issues of our time. We all do our work individually. I'll have a programme about poverty over here, somebody else will have a programme about poverty over there, and there's very little joined up thinking. There's a lack of accountability. So actually, up until very recently, the only accountability that funders and philanthropists have is through the Charity Commission. But again, reporting requirements are very, very minimal. But I think one of the biggest issues that funders and foundations are facing now is to address the question about whether or not we're actually really tackling the causes of systemic inequality. The Victorian model of philanthropy was just based on alleviating symptoms, and that no longer feels relevant. More and more people are questioning the root causes of inequality and poverty and talking about an unfair welfare system, unequal access to education, poor housing, etc., which are systemic issues. Funders on average only give away 4% of the values of the fund that they hold, if they hold endowed funds. So you could be sitting on £100 million a year, and each year, on average, you would only give away £4 million. And there is actually no minimum amount you must pay out in grants. So even if you're sitting on £100 million, you could actually give away just £10,000, £20,000, and you could call yourself a funder, a philanthropist, a trust and a foundation. You would not be doing anything wrong legally. The criticism in many of these books is that many foundations are used for tax purposes, to hoard wealth, and are completely at the mercy of owners' whim. And so as long as you can say you're setting up your foundation and for charity, you can pretty much do what you like. So whilst the UK falls into deeper financial crisis, the cost of living has forced 1 million more children into poverty, and families are struggling to put food on the table, some funders are sitting on mountains of wealth, and no one really scrutinises what they're doing. Now I'm going to talk to you about the one criticism which I feel more than anything, and that's about social change. A significant criticism that we're facing as trusts and foundations is that philanthropy has not had a leading part in the most profound social change in the last 10 years. So if you think about the biggest movements over the last 4 or 5 years, particularly if you think about climate justice, if you think about civil rights, the Me Too movement, these were not led by philanthropists and funders, despite us saying that we've been working for social change for hundreds of years. They had nothing to do with us. They arose from individuals and grassroots community organising. They were built on the ground by individual people fighting for what they believed in. They built a huge groundswell of public opinion, and that's what brought about social change. So we didn't. These movements, I think, are incredibly powerful, and I'm really glad that Alistair specifically talked about the word movement, because these movements have fought for the very ideals that we thought had long been established, such as women's rights over their own bodies, the acknowledgement of injustice against racialised communities, fighting for a cleaner world. All of these movements and ideals have come under sustained attack, and these movements grew as an organic, fluid and powerful response to that attack. So millions of people around the globe were mobilized in a way that has never been seen before. And I think that they were such pivotal, generation-defining moments, but they were not the product of institutional philanthropy or charities. And I think that's something that we really need to think about in terms of how do we mobilize for social change. And you may have some thoughts about that. And some people do say that actually charities and philanthropy have no space to talk about these issues, and they shouldn't be talking about these issues because maybe it's a little bit edgy, maybe it's a little bit too political. But what I would say to that is that philanthropy is already playing a huge part, particularly in the US, in establishing values which we may not be so keen on. And it's happening whether we like it or not. We know that US institutional philanthropy is explicitly being used to dismantle rights and freedoms which we once took for granted. And there's a huge amount of research on this. I'm not saying anything at all controversial. The foundations have been extremely open and explicit about what their agenda is. These foundations are actively funding climate skeptics. They have deliberately shaped the Supreme Court in a way that suits them. They have diminished the rights of marginalised communities, and none of this has been an accident. It has been an organised and extremely well-funded use of philanthropy. So philanthropy is already in this space and in the arena and is influencing whether or not social change happens. And these foundations are using a multitude of tools, including social media platforms, digital technology and disinformation. So I think we as charities and philanthropists and funders need to think about what is our role in this space. Can we really afford to stay out of the arena and allow all these rights to be dismantled, which have been fought for over the last 50 or 60 years? So it was with all of this in my mind that I went across to the US. So I was given a Churchill Fellowship. And last year in July, I travelled to the US thinking about all of these challenges, thinking about the scrutiny and accountability of trusts and foundations and what our role was. And I went to visit funders and foundations, and my main purpose was really to think about the role of charities and funders, but also how do you actually bring about social change? How can we actually shift the dial? So these are some of the funders that I went to speak to, and they're a wide range. So you have like the Ford Foundation, which is $1 billion foundation, huge network, huge infrastructure, big ideas. But then you've also got very small foundations like the Masto Foundation, which is an incredible foundation, set up by Japanese Americans who were actually interned during World War II, but after the war became incredibly successful business people and decided to give back. And it's a very small foundation, but very, very interesting ideas about what philanthropy is. In the Japanese tradition, they don't have the concept of philanthropy in the way that we do. They talk about gifting, which is a completely different mindset from that victorial paternalistic, I'm doing you a favour type of approach. You had family foundations like Strupski, and again, people quite often say, well, family foundations, you know, they tend to be the most conservative. I'm going to give you an example later on about the Strupski Foundation and how radical they have been in terms of their thinking. And I also went to meet very corporate foundations like the Meridian Partners, who I would say are set up in a very corporate business-like way in terms of having very clear outputs, working in a very strategic way, and again, a really interesting model because they're trying to shift the dial. So I went across, I spoke to these 20 foundations, I came back, I tried to digest what they were all saying, coding 20 interviews. I should have used AI, why didn't I think of that? It was quite difficult. But from all of that, what I developed was this transformative module, Transformative Philanthropy, a manual for social change. And I've got a couple of copies here. If someone's quick, they can take them. But it's on the website, and you've got a link there. And the reason that I talked about transformative philanthropy and deliberately used those words is because I do believe that philanthropy should be used for social change. I believe that that's the ultimate purpose of effective philanthropy. Funding which brings about actual social change in society and the lives of communities. And what this isn't is a sort of verbatim account of what people told me. And it's not one of those, I hope, boring academic reports. It is something where I've taken what I was told and tried to build a new model by identifying the key ingredients. So from these 20 funders, what are the common things that they're doing, which is bringing about social change in their communities? So this is the actual model. I'm not going to go through it in a huge amount of detail because it would take another half an hour. But essentially, it's about 4 stages of philanthropy. A stage initially where you really try to understand your communities, your history, social justice, moving on to having a very specific vision, talking about the tools of philanthropy, being very community-centric, intersectional, building movement, which I'll come on to, and then working across sectors, which I think is incredibly important and part of the reason why I'm here today. What instead of talking about all of the different elements, I'm going to talk about a couple of them in a bit more detail, looking at the prism of social justice, collaborating and building movements. And I'm picking on these 3 because I hope that they'll be of particular interest to you. Now, social justice, these are words that we don't tend to use a lot within philanthropy and the charitable sector in the UK. But they were words that just rolled off the tongue of the people that I met in the US. And I was really interested to see why they used those specific words. And because, we don't have a consensus, and there is no consensus about what social justice means. So you talk to one person, it will mean something slightly different. But what they identified were these sort of key 5 elements. So if we're talking about social justice philanthropy, it's really about using collective efforts, and it's about systemic barriers. So it's not about the symptoms, it's all about the causes. So things like, for example, food banks. Food banks are an incredibly important necessity in today's day and age. But the CEO of Churchill Trust a few months ago said that actually she doesn't want any more food banks. And that is not the solution to poverty. More food banks is not the solution to poverty. The solution to poverty is changing the conditions which people live in so that they can, progress, they can be educated, they can get good quality work, they're not on 0-hour contracts, all of those things. Those are the solutions to poverty, not food banks, even though at the moment, we need them for crisis management. But food banks and other solutions like that help people survive within poverty rather than allowing them to escape poverty. And I'm going to pause on social justice for a while because one of my aims is for people to start talking about social justice and use those particular words. Social justice is not something new. There's a long and detailed history where philanthropists have been talking about social justice for hundreds of years. So Mary Wollstonecraft, William Tucker, all argued that unequal distribution of wealth is not a reflection of some sort of justice, but it's a reflection of flawed social structure. So poverty and inequality is not a choice. You know, your circumstances, where you're born, your geography, the region, the family, the ethnicity, all of those things matter as to whether or not you're more likely to be in poverty. And the research and evidence, I mean, Joseph Rowntree, I was talking about this morning, have produced a huge amount of evidence to show that it is systems of disadvantage and inequality which keep people in deprived circumstances. And therefore, you can't really talk seriously about addressing poverty and inequality unless you talk about systemic change. And I want to particularly highlight these two philanthropists. And these two were actually brought to my attention by Rodri, who came and spoke to you last year. And on the same link, he gives a history of social justice philanthropy, where he talks about the prison reformer John Howard. I'm sure most of you know him because of his, the amazing work that he did in relation to prison reform. But he was originally known as a philanthropist. He did give some funding, but his whole campaign was about reforming the prison justice system. You have philanthropists like George Cadbury and Joseph Rowntree, who really, as well as giving away money, they built these villages where workers were treated with respect and with integrity, and they used their ownership of newspapers and their involvement in politics to campaign for change. So the words social justice and philanthropy were not separate. It was the same thing. You didn't have to say social justice philanthropy. It was just understood that if you're working in philanthropy, you're working for social change. And I wanted to give you some more recent examples of organisations taking this space in relation to social change. You have what I would call very justice-focused campaigning organisations like Shelter, the Child Poverty Action Group, and Amnesty International, who are charities obviously providing a service, and they do a huge amount of frontline work, but at the same time they are also building evidence. They're trying to build a collective movement. They're trying to change people's perceptions. An example that Rodri again told me about was the Abortion Law Reform Association, who came together in the 1960s, funded, interestingly, they're based in the UK, but they were funded by a US foundation. They conducted research and polling and were vital in securing a change in the law in 1967 to decriminalise abortion. So again, in our history of charity and philanthropy, we have these organisations who are really bringing about social change in a meaningful and in a genuine way, as well as providing frontline services. They're tackling the root causes of poverty and inequality. And that comes to my second ingredient, which I want to talk about, which is about movement building. And I'm so pleased that Alistair talked about the ecosystem. I know it's one of those phrases that people talk about a lot, but this work cannot be done in isolation. And I think we as a sector within charity and philanthropy have to learn from other organisations, institutions, movements as to how you bring about social change. And now there's a huge amount of research and modelling into why did the Black Lives Matter movement, why was that so successful? Why was that such a critical moment in time which really focused people's minds? What was it about Me Too that really crystallised and demonstrated and showed the impact of discrimination and misogyny on women? In a way that has never been done and never been described before. And, it was, those sort of movements were so pivotal in changing people's minds and changing the narratives of society and making them understand that these are deep systemic issues which communities are facing, and how do we really address them. So, And again, it was the power of individuals, and I keep coming back to this because I'm talking to a group of individuals. It was the power of individuals which built these movements. It was people in their bedrooms posting on social media, talking about what happened to them, talking about their experiences of real life. That created this movement which, you know, institutional charities have not managed to do in our existence. And I think the importance of digital technology to raise awareness, educate, inform, organise and inspire cannot be underestimated. Storytelling and producing content is just as important as giving grants. And then the final ingredient that I want to pause on is the cross-sectoral work. So what I learned from the US was the importance of collaboration across sectors. You need that to tackle deep-seated societal issues. It cannot be done by the charity sector alone. It absolutely cannot. The problems are too deep and too entrenched, and they need a multitude of people with different skills, different talents to come together. So I talked about the Stupski Foundation, and I want to mention one of their program areas is focused on food justice. They believe that everyone should have access to healthy food, people who work in farming and food production should be empowered, and that the environment should be protected. So they critically link all of these three areas together, see them as part of the food system, and are trying to strengthen the food system. Not just by providing good quality work to those who most need it and can least afford it, but also looking at low-paid, insecure work. So a lot of farm workers within these areas had very insecure work, which exacerbated the issues of poverty. They looked again at environmental damage affecting agriculture, and they came up with a whole multiplicity of tools to address this issue. So it wasn't one thing, it wasn't just grant funding, although grant funding is incredibly important. They actually provide funding for urban farms for young people. They provide farmers markets within marginalised communities, community stores which provide jobs. They also fund university centres who do focused research. They organise wildfire management courses and training, and they provide small loans to farmers. I mean, that's just an example. If you want to go and look into, you know, the depth of what they do, because I can just give you a flavour. But what I think is really important is that they work across all spheres. There's a real cross-sectoral public-private partnership, which I think is incredibly important. And another example is the San Francisco Foundation, and I don't know how many of you have been to San Francisco recently, but the problem of homelessness is, I mean, I can't really describe it to you unless you go there. It's at a critical point. And this is in one of the wealthiest places in the US. So the disparity between the haves and the have-nots is incredible to witness. San Francisco Foundation fund a lot of cross-sectoral collaborations. This particular one was in relation to housing and building healthy and thriving communities. So they have an initiative called Hope San Francisco, which is rebuilding 4 public housing sites. So these are housing which were formerly, you know, council-owned, local authority-owned. They've got a collaboration with the private sector to rebuild them. They provide affordable loans as well for those normally financially excluded, again, working with the private sector. They also empower individuals and local community members to advocate in city development plans to ensure that affordable housing, community-serving retail, services like childcare centres, all the must-have for development, which puts people first, are included. So this is about representation. This is not actually about San Francisco Foundation being on those city development boards. It's about empowering local communities to be able to do that. And what I noticed with these funders and the other funders, and the one thing that I think I've taken away the most, is that these funders and foundations are so ambitious in terms of what they see for the future. And I think quite often as a charity sector and a philanthropy sector, we retreat and we go further in just because of the scale of problems that we're dealing with, and it's completely understandable. But these funders and foundations, regardless of the circumstances that they were in, had a really bold vision, and they were unapologetic about their vision. They were unapologetic about using social justice as a lens. They were unapologetic about tackling huge systemic issues, and I think there's, we have a huge amount to learn from that. So coming towards the end of my presentation, I want to talk about examples of social change, again, not traditional charity, which are ambitious and bold, but in a very sort of micro way, they are having a profound impact on the charity and philanthropy sector. And this is really to illustrate the point that each generation needs to utilise the tools that it has at its disposal. And I want to touch on a few tools which I've come across to show that you don't have to be a traditional worker in a charity to be part of a movement for social change. And in fact, there's an argument to say that the fact that you've not been institutionalized within the charity sector is a good thing as well. But these are tools that I just wanted to highlight. Obviously, I'm going to talk about 360 Giving because I'm the chair of 360 Giving, but this was set up 5 or 6 years ago by an incredible woman, Fran Perrin, who realised and advocated tirelessly for funders and foundations to share their data on who they fund. Now, this may not sound like a big deal, but as I mentioned before, philanthropy has always struggled with transparency. So getting funders, particularly family foundations, to work together to give away their data and talk about where the funding has been a huge challenge that 360 have been really pivotal in changing that conversation. First 5 or 6 years have been spent on persuading people and funders to put their data on the website, and it's been incredibly useful for the charitable sector. The next 5 years, what we're looking at 360 Giving is data functionality and utility. So now we've got this massive data and it's publicly available. What do you do with it? How do you make it helpful? How do we identify areas where there's a huge amount of funding going and areas where there's very little funding going? And not just in terms of geography, but in terms of issues. There are popular areas of funding and there are unpopular areas of funding which are just as needed. So we're in that stage where we're really thinking about how we make that data useful and valuable for the charitable sector. Oops. The other things that I should mention, a foundation practice rating, which again was set up by one woman with a really clear vision, Danielle Walker-Palmer, who is the CEO of Friends Provident Foundation, and it's a really interesting model for how you bring about the change within charities and philanthropy. So up until the foundation practice rating came into being, there was no method of independently looking across trusts and foundations and assessing them. And this has never happened before, where foundations and trusts have been assessed or scrutinised or held to account against a set of objective criteria. This process, where these foundations were assessed against criteria in relation to transparency, diversity, etc., this was done independent of the foundation's consent. And at the time, it caused a huge uproar because foundations were like, how can somebody else who's not part of the sector, who's not internal, assess what we're doing? But these are the days where we're living, where you have to, if you're working in the public sphere, you have to take on the fact that you will be accountable and you will be scrutinised for what you're doing. And I think now foundation practice rating has, the first year it came out, there was huge uproar. People were saying it's not fair that we're being assessed and we haven't consented. 3 years later, it's really shifted the conversation. And the number of foundations on the day that this is revealed, the rating is revealed, are on their, on their website checking what their rating is. Is it A, is it B or C? Because their trustees are asking now, what rating are we? How do we measure against X or Y? And so as a tool for bringing about social change, I know it sounds boring, but transparency and scrutiny are incredibly important. And also I wanted to talk about Charity So White, which again, I think really held a mirror up to the charitable sector. And again, is a movement started by individuals using social media platforms, particularly Twitter at that time, to talk about their experiences of being in the charitable sector. And as a result of that, so many charities that I know, so many funders I know took action to really seriously look at the experiences of racialized communities within the charitable sector. And it was a real moment where the mirror was held up. Again, it was not a large charity that was behind this, it was individuals, it was people. So I want to end with this final quote, where hopefully I've convinced you that building a better world is not about charity, but it is about social change. And that social change is now happening in new, innovative ways outside traditional structures and institutions. And it's something that we can all be part of if we have the motivation and the conviction. Each of us can bring about social change in a way which has never been seen before, and that's particularly important at this time when we are facing critical challenges. And I want to be clear that I am an optimist about this work, even though I may not sound it. I really do believe that, and this is part of the reason that I'm here talking to you, is because I believe that the more people we can get in the private sector particularly to utilise their motivation for social change, the more we can shift the situation in this country for children, young people and for families. And again, I would emphasise that philanthropy is not necessarily about giving money. It can be about giving time, skills, capacity, and therefore every act that each of you individually do as part of the Scottish Tech Army has the potential to be transformative. So thank you.
Okay to take a couple of questions? Thank you so much. Absolutely amazing presentation. I'm sure you'll agree. We have got a couple of minutes for any questions. I have a microphone. I think Kirsty has a microphone as well. So we've got the room covered. Does anyone have a question to pose to Fozia on the back of that? It's going to take someone brave to be the first person to put that. We've got a brave person right there. Here we go.
Is this on? Yes, it is. Thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. The numbers you quoted at the beginning were 90 billion of assets, I think, and 4 billion of annual grants. I take it that's for the UK, not America.
That's for the UK.
Thank you. Those numbers are absolutely amazing. Thank you very much.
Hi there, thanks for a nice presentation. I just wanted to ask, I think I'm right in saying in the US the IRS requires a minimum giving annually to maintain that charitable status. I mean, presumably that's something we should be doing in the UK as well.
I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so in America, foundations and funders have a minimum 4% that they have to give away in terms of the value of their assets. In the UK, we have no minimum. And it's really interesting, the conversation that they're having in the US about that 4%. They're talking about, a lot of funders and philanthropists say, oh, the 4% is the ceiling that we should aim for. And charities are saying, that's not the ceiling, that's the floor. That's literally the floor. You haven't even got off the floor in terms of talking about the value of assets. But there is no minimum requirement for trusts and foundations in the in the UK to give away any of their wealth.
And just to plus one, there's also a model of charities and philanthropies that are trying to spend their wealth as well, right?
That's
over the lifetime value of the of the creators, for example, which is
that's interesting. And there's a real debate. I don't know if you know that Lankelly Chase, which is a funder based in London, has decided to spend down because their argument, I've spoken to their CEO, their argument is that Rome is burning. And if you're not going to use your assets now, what are you waiting for? Are you waiting for things to get worse? And I think there is some validity in what they're saying, but I also do believe that there is utility in foundations being there for the long term as well. It's a balance between the two. I'm not one. I don't go one way or the other in that argument.
Another question back here, and then one down here.
No, really fascinating. Just focusing on the social justice arguments you were making, and I very much agree with you, but I'm just thinking about how these things are playing out. You know, the National Trust being criticised for being woke, for just showing some of the origins and broadening the history of what it does, makes me intrigued by then how that would play out, particularly when you start dealing with entrenched power, and vested interests. And so it isn't just that Victorian model of sweeping up poverty, but actually trying to tackle some of those systematic inequalities. What happens then when you've already seen a backlash on quite small things? And is this the moment that philanthropists actually have to be braver? But, I mean, I've done quite a lot, so I work in the university, did quite a lot of research during COVID around some of these things, talking to funders and foundations. And then the trustees, particularly of City London Corporation, I won't name names, but some of those got very nervous about some of these things because they're part of the problem that's trying to be fixed. So there's a tension inherently there, it seems to me.
There is, absolutely. And this is the tension that is, I think, right at the heart of what philanthropy is struggling with at the moment. There's a recognition that values that we thought were established are being torn down. And philanthropy's space has, some people would say philanthropy's space is to be completely objective and neutral and not meddle in this. But we're being drawn into it because foundations who oppose many of the values we hold are funding in that space. And I think it's a conversation for each trust and foundation, and it depends on what their values are. I'll give you an example of an organisation which I think has done it really well, has managed this situation really well, which is the RNLI. So the RNLI, obviously, you know, their job is to save lives at sea, and there was an article, I can't remember which newspaper, criticising them for rescuing refugees off the coast. And, you know, there was this attempt to whip up public opinion and a sort of a moral panic against the RNLI saving people's lives. I think the RNLI's response was so brilliant because they just re-emphasised their purpose in a very simple statement, talking about their purpose is not to enter culture wars or be political. Their purpose is to save people's lives. That's it. And you know, as a result of that, I think their fundraising increased by 300% over the next few weeks because people understood what they stood for, understood the humanity in what they were saying. And so we quite often, I think, underestimate the British public and in terms of their sense of fairness. But this is exactly the critical issue that I think all charities and funders need to grapple with. I agree with you.
We've got one more question down here, and then we're going to break.
Hi. Obviously, we're based in tech, and the big question I would like to ask you is, where do you see tech playing the biggest role in a lot of these things? Is it the ability to be transparent for these philanthropic, unlike you, these philanthropic places to make them more visible, or is it the grassroots of helping people try and get into tech to get them out of poverty, or is it even at the charity level, like with the San Francisco one, maybe getting people to communicate or coordinate better using it? Like, where do you think could be the key places that these things could obviously help?
I would say all of the above, but my personal opinion, the ability to communicate is one of the most critical tools you have to have in this day and age, and the charity sector is just not good at it. You know, we've got a few outliers, but we're not good at talking about why we do what we do. We're not good at restating our values when we're faced with criticism. We're not good at talking about poverty even. Most people in the UK still think poverty is a group of people who are on benefits. Poverty, the biggest growing area in terms of poverty in terms of people are those who are in work, but are low paid, working on 0 hours contracts. So if we can just change people's perceptions about what poverty is, and I think about, for example, the documentary on the post office. That was a story. That was just a story of a person, but it was just communicated so well. And it created this groundswell of public opinion, which has changed how that situation has been dealt with. If we can create and communicate better stories and better understanding and better inform people about what charity is, what inequality is, what poverty is, I think we would just achieve so much more. So that's what I would really like to see from the tech sector.
Fantastic. Sorry, I lied. There's one more question.
Oh, okay.
Fozia, thank you. Harvey Carruthers from Five Young Carers. So we're a medium-sized local charity, and the young people that we deal with they're predominantly from poor areas. They have multiple social issues, and so I'm just trying to think, when I go back, what's the action that I take?
I would really love for people to start talking about social justice. Because when you talk, social justice in essence is about systemic failures. So even when you're talking to young people, and I talk to children and young people, sometimes they feel that they're in a situation which is inescapable and which is partly their fault. And when I talk about systemic barriers and systemic issues, that actually, if you live in this particular geography, you're more likely to X, Y, and Z. It's going to be harder for you to do X, Y, and Z. It's not your fault, and it's not because of who you are that you're in this situation. But there are certain barriers which are keeping you in that position. I'm sure the work that you do and we do at Children in Need is trying to lift people out of those circumstances. So I think re-emphasising that this is not about choice, these are systemic barriers, and using the words of social justice. I think when you take language is incredibly important. When you take something which is on the margins to the mainstream, that's when you create social change. So if we can all start talking about social justice, if we can all start recognising there are these systemic issues, then I think that will be the foundation for all the conversations going forth, because then if you're having that conversation that these issues, poverty, inequality, housing, education, health, all of these issues are systemic in nature, we will be having very different conversations.
If that wasn't a call to action, I don't know what was. Ladies and gentlemen, please a round of applause again for Fozia.